Ontario Premier Doug Ford is defending his government's appointment of two former staffers to a committee that recommends which lawyers should become judges in Ontario.
We got elected to get like-minded people in appointments, and by the rules, you can't have lawyers picking judges, so you have to have citizens. I'm not going to appoint some NDP or some Liberal. Every single appointment I can to find tough judges, tough JPs, to keep guys in jail, and I say guys because 99.9% are guys, I'm going to do it. So that's part of democracy.
So this was all first reported by the Toronto Star that Matthew Bondy and Brock Vandrick were appointed to the committee. Bondy was formerly Deputy Chief of Staff to the Premier, and Vandrick was Ford's Director of Stakeholder Relations. For reaction to all of this and the Premier's defense of these appointments, Douglas Judson is the chair of the Federation of Ontario Law Associations, and he joins me now. Hello, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You heard the Premier there today. He said this is part of democracy in defending the appointments. What do you make of that comment?
Well, I think the Premier's comments reflect a fairly fundamental misapprehension of the importance of having an independent judiciary in our justice system, and also a fairly juvenile understanding of why that matters in a democratic system, and how harmful those types of politicizing comments are to our courts, to our justice system, and to public confidence in the administration of justice.
Why is that harmful? Is it the fact that he's appointed two people who worked in his office, or is it his comments about wanting tougher judges and tougher sentences? What's your assessment of that?
Well, I think what happened today was the Premier dug in on those appointments. And I think less concerning are those two individuals who are appointed and the tenor of the comments, which suggest that the Premier is open to more political and partisan wrangling of this committee, which is supposed to function independently and supposed to remove patronage from the judicial appointments process in Ontario. Now, people need to understand that we're talking about the provincial court in Ontario. That is where most of the criminal and a large portion of the family matters are heard in Ontario. What the Premier's comments suggest is that not only do they want final say on the short list of people who become judges, but they want more political involvement, partisan involvement in the generation of that short list at the advisory committee level.
Okay, so these two appointments being staffers, we often see on committees like this people who have donated to political parties getting appointed. Is that okay? Is any political connection okay? Or is it the fact that they worked in the Premier's office? Is that the bridge too far for you?
I think the bridge too far are really the comments themselves, not so much the appointments. We can look to many types of appointments that happen both federally and provincially across the country, and we will see people that have some ties, stronger, some weaker, to various parties that are in power. What the Premier is suggesting is that because they win an election, they get to politically contort who gets to become a judge in the province, how the selection process for that plays out. And I think a lot of people will hear his comments today and hear a very strong insinuation that if you have ties to any other political party, to a political ideology that does not align with the government, then you will not find yourself an appointment to the bench. And that is very damaging for the fabric of our society, because what it does is it undermines our confidence in that institution and suggests that judges are not fairly adjudicating what's before them, but they are in fact political actors.
Okay, that's interesting because as a political host and reporter, when I heard those comments today, it sounded to me like a Premier defending what could be called a patronage appointment, political loyalists. You see it very much on the administrative and credibility of the justice system side of things. So you're not too upset that Mr. Bondy and Mr. Vandrick are there. They could stay there as far as you're concerned, as long as the Premier hadn't said what he said in defending them. Am I reading it right?
Well, speaking out for the Ontario Bar, we're generally concerned with systemic issues in the justice system. I'm not really in a position to comment on Mr. Vandrick or Mr. Bondy's particular credentials for this committee. What I am concerned about is whether partisan credentials matter to become a member of the judiciary. And I think what we heard from the Premier today is a suggestion that if you fall outside of their party lines, you will have a more difficult path to doing that. And it suggests, manipulation of that process, which is very damaging to the checks and balances we have in our democratic system. So we're seeing a lot of this language, I think, coming from the right now, which suggests, well, I won an election, so now I'm going to stack the deck completely in our favor. But what people need to remember is that when you win an election, you also have responsibility to be a good steward of our institutions and the balance between them. And in this case, the Attorney General in particular has a very strong role to play in upholding the rule of law, that everyone can get a fair hearing, and keeping political interference out of our courts in this selection process. So that is what the bar is really upset about today and what we're seeing in the legal community in reaction to these comments.
So you called the Premier's comment contagious. What did you mean by that?
I think that we're seeing a lot of this type of commentary from people in positions of power, particularly on the right now, suggesting that they can move the goalposts of what we ought to accept for political interference in institutions and of the checks and balances over their own government. Remember, the courts are in place to provide an impartial adjudication when you are charged with an offense by the government or have some other dispute that needs to be resolved in that forum. So for governments to, I think, start to imply that, there are all these people out here that aren't tough enough on crime, and all these judges, these justices of the peace are part of the opposition to the mandate that we're trying to put forward. It is very damaging to the fabric of our society. It undermines the democratic checks and balances that we have. And ultimately, I think that is something that, as Canadians, we're more used to seeing south of the border from MAGA Republicans. I was certainly aghast to hear those types of words coming from a Canadian premier this morning.
Okay, Ontario Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie is calling for these appointments to be reversed. What is your position here? I mean, you're speaking out against it. What would you like to see done, and what actions might you take in opposition to this move?
Well, I think people are going to question any appointment the government makes about whether the person was best suited, who else applied. Many of these are prerogatives that come with government. Again, most of our concern has been with the specific remarks from the premier, suggesting very strongly that there ought to be more political intervention in the appointments to the bench. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Governments will, I think, live or die by the decisions they make when we go to the polls, and people will have their own conclusions about whether those were good appointments. And I have no information about the credentials of those two individuals or their suitability for appointment. But at the end of the day, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, just as a final point, extrapolating from the Premier's comments about keeping 99.9%, mostly guys, in there, keeping them in jail, it sounds like they have a bias for judges or judicial candidates who will mete out heavy sentences or have strict bail conditions. I mean, that's what I draw from that. I mean, how do you interpret that as a lawyer, and how do you think that's going to be interpreted throughout the court system?
Well, I think the bar is interpreting that as, if you are involved in prosecution or law enforcement, step right up. If you are a Liberal or an NDP or involved in criminal defense or have ties to any other political movement, perhaps you should not. That is not a healthy notion for our justice system. Unlike the Americans, we don't have liberal judges and conservative judges. We just tend to have good judges. Keep in mind, these comments aren't just damaging to those who might be appointed in the future, but it suggests that anyone who's been appointed by this government was subject to a political litmus test. And I think that itself is unfair. It's damaging to the institution, but we're talking about people that also can't defend themselves.
Douglas Judson, we appreciate your time. That's Douglas Judson, Chair of the Federation of Ontario Law Associations. Thank you, sir.